Welcome to Pop and Locke. I am Landry Ayers, and as hard as it may be, I promise to our audience I will not do any of my very, very poor impressions on the show today, even though it would be oh so fun because today we are taking a trip down to Arlen, Texas to talk Mike Judge's classic animated series, King of the Hill. Joining me today to discuss the benefits of propane and propane accessories are co-founder of Feminists for Liberty, Kat Murti.
Thanks for having me.
And a first-time guest on the show. We are so happy to have editor-at-large at Reason, Nick Gillespie. Nick, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleased as punch to be here.
An interesting sort of thought experiment that I like to propose whenever King of the Hill comes up with people I haven't talked about it with before is the question of what would Hank Hill have done during the 2016 election? It exposes a lot of the assumptions we have about the kind of character he is and the place that this show is set in. And a lot of the other characters sort of intersect with the imagined storylines that we dream up when we think about the moral quandary that Hank Hill would have to go through in order to decide who to vote for in that particular election. So I pose that question to you two as well as we get started. What would Hank have done as the 2016 election was happening? You know, you've got Hillary and you've got Donald Trump. And what would happen in the 2020 election, you think, after the 4 years of Trump having been president?
Landry, if I may, and I really hope to hell that you were named after Tom Landry, who's also the namesake of the middle school in Arlen, Texas.
I was due on Super Bowl Sunday.
All right. And, Tom Landry, by the way, is one of the great loser Super Bowl coaches. I mean, he did get one, but it's like he's like a hair's breadth away from being Marv Levy, a real high-performance loser.
I think my parents must have just been fans of men who wear fedoras all the time or something like that.
Especially on the football field. Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Libertarianism, Landry.
That's what it is, yeah.
So first off, and you of course elided the fact that there was a fascinating alternative candidate in 2016 named Gary Johnson, a two-term Western state governor that I think Hank would have toyed with voting for, but then would have been like, he's a little too high all the time. My sense of this, and we can get into the reasons why. I think that Hank Hill would have voted for Trump in 2016 because he wanted something different. And I think the real reveal is I think that he would have voted for Obama in the spirit of hope and change in 2012. And he would have been disappointed by Obama and hence goes with Trump. And then he would have been disappointed with Trump. And I don't know that he would have voted for Biden. I think he might have voted for Jo Jorgensen because she seems a kind of motherly Peggy Hill-esque character. And I mean that in all of the ambivalent ways that you could take that.
Can you walk me through that line of thinking really quick? Like, what was it that you think would have made Hank an Obama voter? And how do we go from that point on? Because to me, that's a big sort of inflection point for the type of choices you think he might make.
Well, I think you got to bring it back to, King of the Hill is ultimately a Texas exceptionalism show. I mean, it does not take place in the United States as much as it takes place in Texas. And this is a state, you guys have much deeper histories with Texas than I do, having been raised there. I lived in Huntsville, Texas, the center of where the death chamber is, the center of the Texas Department of Corrections. And that locates, that's one of, a great identity source for Texas, that it has this overly, determined and powerful correction system. Texas has put more people to death, in any given year than like all of the other states put together for like 10 years. And I think, so what I'm getting at is Hank would have been fed up with George W. Bush. He would have obviously hated George H.W. Bush as a fake Texan. He would have been okay with W, and then he would have been like, you are terrible, and you are centralizing everything in Washington. Because I think in a lot of ways what King of the Hill is ultimately about is not a broad decentralization, but a skepticism of centralized power, whether it's corporate power, whether it's political power. Lo Mart is a problem. It's both necessary and good for the community, but it's also a problem. I think Hank would have gone through 7 stages of grief with George W. Bush and having to come reckon with the fact that between LBJ, H.W. Bush, and W. Bush, Texas has an unblemished record of shitty presidents.
Well,
And
he
he would
clearly
have,
liked LBJ enough to name his dog Ladybird.
right, well, no, but Lady Bird, not LBJ, right? Because Lady Bird is ineffectual. But and I think he would have been an Obama supporter because he would have grudgingly wanted something new and different. And he would have been repulsed by the Republican Party and how it acted under W. Bush, which was to agglomerate power, to centralize it, and to make the government bigger and bigger, really. And I think he would have been fed up with that, and he would not have voted for Hillary Clinton. She is kind of the incarnation of many of the things that he seems to rail against, which is a feminized culture, somebody who is constantly telling other people what to do, and locating meaning in DC or outside of local communities. So I think he would have gone with Trump, and then he would have been like, "Oh, what a jackass!" Right? Because Trump is too crude and a blowhard. Right? Trump didn't deliver enough on the things that he said he was going to do. So I think Hill would have, where he lands in 2020. That's a good question.
I actually think something very different from Nick here. I think that the default assumption, you look at Hank Hill, he's, a middle-aged guy, small town Texas, fairly personally conservative. You would see him be like, okay, well, he's clearly a Republican. He's going to vote for Trump. And I actually don't think that he would be. I think that he is a never Trumper. And it's Hank Hill hates vulgarity. And Hank Hill, you kind of see his character develop throughout the series. He really cares about what he sees as bad behavior towards women, whether it's his wife Peggy, whether
or
it's
Luann. Yeah,
he's very protective of Luann. He's very protective. I mean, at some point he steps up for his colleague who he finds out is a sex worker and steps up against her pimp. He has a troubled relationship with his dad for a number of reasons, but in part because he doesn't like the way that he treats his stepmom / Hank's kindergarten classmate. He wouldn't have liked Trump. He would have wanted to vote Republican, I think, but he would have not liked Trump, both because he's a New Yorker, but also because he's vulgar and he didn't like the way that he talked. He didn't like the way he treated women. So I think he's a never Trumper. I think Dale Gribble is full on MAGA hat, like talking about Hillary's emails, has all the conspiracy theories. And then I kind of see Bill Jotreve struggling between the two. Yeah, because he wants to wear the hat. He wants to be cool like Dale, but he looks up to Hank Hill. He wants to be Hank. Hank is his hero, right? So I think he's kind of pulled between the two. Boomhauer I'm seeing is either just not voting at all, or like he's gonna, I could see him going Trump. I could see him even voting Hillary, or maybe he's the LP.
Oh, I think Boomhauer is a total Garjo, Gary Johnson. Yeah,
I
because
can see it.
He's actually minimal government and he's lifestyle liberation. And you can hear him say like, "Bake the damn cake."
Right.
Like
yeah,
he
oh
would
my
have been,
gosh.
he would have been there, like, what,
Yeah, I could see Boomhauer, in his little tiger striped Speedo is voting for Gary Johnson.
How I picture
Peggy Hill is going to be Hillary Clinton hard. Yeah. Peggy Hill is Hillary Clinton's base, right? She's a Texas woman. She's a Montana woman. She wouldn't have liked certain parts of Hillary Clinton, but she is the woman who wants to back Hillary Clinton because she's a female candidate, not for any other reason.
She's a vagina-centric voter.
Right. Yeah,
right?
She is. Yeah. She is. I mean, that brings me back to the episode where she's studying, where she has to be the sex ed substitute teacher. Like, that is her struggle in this whole episode. You're going to see Nancy Gribble, Dale's wife. I think she's voting Trump, and she's going to be shaming Peggy because Peggy wants to support Hillary Clinton. And, Luann's off there voting for the Green Party or whatever minority communist candidate she can write in.
Who is John Redcorn voting for?
John Redcorn, I could see him kind of coming out against both candidates.
Yeah.
A principled non-voter.
I could see him again. I want to see the cast go mostly for Gary Johnson in 2016,
I
but I
could see
realize
him
that's a
maybe
reach.
going Gary Johnson, but I don't know if
It's
he's
yeah,
going to. I
Sure.
actually think in 2020, Hank Hill might look back and then vote for Trump because
ah,
he doesn't like a lot of the vulgarity and those kinds of things, but he's going to say, well, he was good for the economy, he was good for propane.
yeah,
Hank is a
that's true.
propane voter.
See that? Yeah, that's why I think he would have been so disappointed. Like, I think that Hank is in that middle where it's like he has hope and change, and he's constantly disappointed. So he would be lurching towards whoever offered, the alternative of what just happened. And then that's where I think in 2020, it's just too much, where you have the major parties have swapped in and out of, the presidency and out of Congress, and they've just been terrible. And I think he would have pulled the switch for Joe Jorgensen then, just as the first protest vote, because Hank is, he's very conventional. He's
Mhm.
individualistic and idiosyncratic, but he is very normal, and I think that's where his limit would be.
I think Hank and Luann are the two candidates who are sort of the people that the Libertarian Party wants to persuade and is constantly struggling to get across, right? Luann, because she wants change in a very different way. She's kind of attracted to these radical ideas, etc., but she's a little wishy-washy on what exactly she supports. She's not super ideological, but you could get a libertarian vote out of Luann. And Hank Hill is much more this like, I just stay out of my business, leave me alone to my lawn and my beer and my buddies. And, that's what libertarians kind of want, right? And he's going to be pulled into the Republican Party because he is personally a conservative, but he's not a bigot. He's not, he doesn't like big government. And,
Not at
fundamentally,
all.
like he doesn't like the idea of radicalism, but I think he likes the idea of just leave me alone.
Right. I think it's interesting because 2020 really complicates it. When it was just the 2016 election, I feel like you could come to a more conclusive answer. But then when you get to 2020, the disappointment of Donald Trump.
Sadly, you're speaking for the entire country, right? Like, if history had ended in 2016, we could be like, okay,
Yeah,
whatever,
certainly.
now.
But there's a lot of ways that this could go. I do think Hank might feel I wouldn't call it duty, but the draw of voting for Trump, but would be turned off by the vulgarity. I think the sort of austere, reserved nature that he
I don't think
exhibits, and the
he'll do
fact
it.
that yeah,
I
the
think he'll
fact that
struggle with
Trump
it.
is like he's a Yankee, he's a New Yorker, so you can't support that by any means. But it would
But
be
who's
like,
he running against? He's
right,
running
but that's
against a fake New Yorker,
well, here's what
right?
I'll say.
Yeah.
Here's what I'll say. It's not Hillary Clinton that he votes for and that's the real tension of the imagined storyline I have in my head is he goes in and he's like, I don't like any of these candidates. He's thought about Gary Johnson, but I could see it being like Boomhauer coming to him and being like, and saying something and trying to persuade him, and Hank having some pithy, offhanded comment about throwing away your vote and how we have a duty
Right.
and it's a waste. And so the real,
American flag in the
That
background.
he's
Yeah.
not a
right,
litter bug, so why would you throw
exactly.
away your vote, right?
Right. But he would be like, well, what am I going to do then? And it's, him deciding. And it would come down to he could either write in Ronald Reagan, like somebody did,
Right,
with the electoral vote.
right.
He would just be like, it's symbolic for me. It's about my character and my values. Or if part of the tension is Peggy trying to convince him to do the right thing and she's pushing him to do what she thinks is right and to vote for Hillary, it would get to the very end and you wouldn't see who he votes for, but you see him check the box and he comes home and Peggy's like, well, what did you end up deciding? What did you do? And he said, well, I voted for the only woman that I think is qualified for the job. And she's like, oh, I'm so proud of you, Hank. And then he goes, I voted for you, Peggy. And he would
Yeah.
vote for Peggy Hill for president. And it would be the same as, throwing it away, but it would be him, reinforcing his sort of support for
Support for
her
his
and
wife.
thinking.
Yeah.
Yes. So
It is.
that's what I
Actually,
see.
I think there's going to be another element there, right? I think it's also Khan, his neighbor. is going to be a big Hillary Clinton fan and is going to be using that
I
to
think yeah.
annoy. I think he would. I
I
think he
think
would be
Khan
doing
is
it
total
to
Trump
annoy.
bait though, because he's a troll, and he wants to make money. I think he identifies with Trump as the gold-plated entrepreneur.
I could see that
Um,
too. I could see that too. I don't know. I could see it going either way because I can also
yeah,
see a whole story arc where Hank is annoyed by Khan, who's using Hillary Clinton just to
yeah, beat
irritate.
up on the rednecks.
Beat up on the
Yeah, you're a
rednecks,
basket
and
of
then
deplorable.
so Hank feels like he has to support Trump for that reason, but he doesn't like him and he doesn't want to support him. And then maybe at the end of the day, Khan votes for Trump.
Yeah.
Oh, I can definitely see Khan voting for
That
Trump.
would I would love to see, that in the booth, like all of them have their public commitments, but then all of them would actually be voting for the other person in the secrecy of the ballot booth.
You see that like conflict
Yeah.
going on, and there'd be the tense climax of the episode of zooming in on everyone's eyes as they're beginning to sort of decide what they really, really want, and the sort of breaking tension of them walking out, and at the end of the day, all being a part of the same community and sort of resuming their lives, sort of with the same mundanity that they experience every single day, and it ends with them drinking beer in the alley behind the house, just saying, "Yep."
I mean, one of the things that I find interesting, and I love King of the Hill when it debuted in 1997. I was living in Huntsville, Texas, which is about 80 miles north of Houston. It's a small town. It's a prison town, a university town. My ex-wife was teaching at Sam Houston State, and I had moved from L.A. So I'm like the twig boy, the bureaucratic eunuch who shows up in the first episode and various other episodes to kind of bedevil Hank with governmental overreach, but there's something about the show that captures how government matters, and Hank and the universe there is very invested in kind of public space and doing things as a community, but also there's so much tension. But ultimately, it is that Arlen is going to have to take care of Arlen's problems. And that even if you go to Austin, that's already a distant
Austin
capital.
is
That's
big government, which is how
yeah,
Texans
Right.
actually feel.
right.
Sure.
But even
Yeah.
and this for me was one of the I was moving there from L.A. I had started at Reason in '93. Moved to Texas in '97, and I was like, okay, great. I am going to go to a state of rugged individualists where everybody is kind of a small government person, and I was like, holy. Like Texas, it's two forms of big government, right? And it was, George Bush was governor at the time, but it's like there's a Republican conservative big government thing that just wants to plow huge piles of land, ground into big things. And, and then there's a Democratic version of it. And I was so kind of disappointed, but I feel like Hank kind of embodies that Texan tension between being an individualist, being self-reliant, but also being really invested in kind of communal identity and to a certain degree big government, but not one that is then dictating every little procedure that you do in your office. So it's a conflict that I think is broadly representative of where most Americans are.
Texas, especially because it's geographically situated really at the nexus of the West and the South. I find you have this like old South traditional legacy going on there. It's just on the cusp, but it also, because of its independent sort of Lone Star identity of being the only recognized place, and it's on the cusp of the West.
And it's
Yes.
also a border state. It's,
Yes.
but I want to, and just to hopefully get under your guys' skin, but certainly any listeners who are from Texas, it's really important to know that, Texas fought for independence in order to maintain slavery.
Right.
Which comes up in
absolutely.
an episode. And like, that's the conundrum. And in a weird way, Texas, by most demographic accounts, is going to overtake California sometime around 2050 as the most populous state. That's when it will become the kind of central cultural myth-making entity of the U.S. in the way that New York State had been until California replaced, and then California will be replaced by Texas, not Florida, because it's bigger. But, that tension which runs through so much of American, cultural myth-making and national identity is so marbled throughout Texas. It's It's going to be exciting and it'll have a new accent, but we're going to be dealing with a lot of the same problems. And I think part of that is, the South was the ultimate big government state. The Confederacy was an incredibly repressive authoritarian regime for,
Right.
whites,
It's
as obviously
ultimately
for black.
against human liberty.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so like, whew, this is going to be, and I think this is one of the reasons I love King of the Hill. And it doesn't resolve these things. It just it's like scenario planning. Every episode was about, okay, here are all these things going on in the culture that are at odds with each other, and how, if you are a good faith person and a good faith citizen, and this takes place in a wonderfully kind, ultimately loving universe. But it's like, how do you deal with this?
What the show is meant to do, though. The show is not meant to be a political show. Mike Judge even said that. It's a show about populism, but it's not a show about politics, right? And I think that it's pretty reflective of life in Texas. So I grew up in the area that Arlen, Texas was based on. It was based on essentially an amalgamation of Garland, Texas and Richardson, Texas. I grew up, which are suburbs of Dallas. I grew up in Dallas. I graduated from Richardson High School in Richardson, Texas. And I
You
grew up.
pledge allegiance to Don Meredith and Troy Aikman.
We did have to say the Texas Pledge every day.
Yeah.
We did have to say the Texas Pledge. I refused to say the pledge all the way through school because I don't like made pledge things.
Yeah, we
that's
have
fair.
to, in quotes. Yeah.
Kat, what was it like being it's also, because the Dallas-Fort Worth area is like so international and cosmopolitan, but it's also like growing up as an ethnic minority, right?
Well, so that's quite interesting, right? So like I always sort of related a little bit to Connie, because she's that Asian girl. She's the children of immigrants. My parents are not Khan or Min, thankfully, I guess. They're much more likable people, I think.
So they got into
But-
a
I'm
good
sure.
country club.
No country clubs in Dallas for us, unfortunately. But yeah, like I mean, I definitely always related to Connie with that show, and the show itself. Growing up watching it, I loved it because it was a parody of the world around me. The people that I knew were exactly like the people in that show. The types of conflicts, that's what was happening around me all the time, including kind of like there's this casual racism that happens a lot of times with the I'm not Laotian, I'm Indian, but the same thing with these folks.
Get my bags, Mr. Khan.
So that, or when they first meet, when they first move in, when the Susanophones first move in, and the Hill's going to greet them, and I think Hank Hill says, "So are you Chinese or Japanese?" And he's like, "Oh, we're Laotian." He's like, "Oh, okay. So is that Chinese or Japanese?" And they're not doing it to be hateful; they just don't know any better. Which was sort of similar. Folks would always bring us people who spoke a language that they didn't speak, that wasn't English or Spanish, and they would bring them to our house and tell us, "Okay, translate." It's like, I don't know what language they're speaking. Not one I know. But, so that was very, so I loved the show. I thought it was great. And then I moved to California and I learned other people like the show, and I was shocked because I was like, why would you like a show about Richardson, Texas? What do you have? What is this? And the thing is that it's like a slice of life show, and it's just very realistic. And it's the way that these characters interact. I think that speaks to people, even if that's not them. Even if, Luann Platter's name is not a funny joke to them because they grew up going to Luby's and getting the Luann Platter.
When I tell you, Kat, that I just got that joke after all these years,
Are you kidding me?
I'm like when you said
Clearly
Luby's, I was
you've
like
not
the
been to
Luann Platter. I'm so dumb. I can't believe it because you best
An
believe we
entree,
were.
two sides, and a dessert.
Oh my gosh, you love the Luann Platter, and all the blue hairs are out there, and you got to join them. It's oh my gosh, Luby's.
I got to tell you, and one of the biggest mass shootings in American history was at a Luby's, right? Outside of Killeen, Texas, or in Killeen, Texas. And after eating there, I kind of understand the motivation of the shooter. Terrible
yes.
Too much Jell-O.
I will say, Kat, it's interesting that you really enjoyed it, like when you were younger, and because you were like seeing it all around you,
like,
and
this is the world that I live in, and I was
right,
looking at like these kinds of conversations, these kind of like the conversations about things like sex ed or about Cinco de Mayo or, those kinds of things, like the people with the couch drinking the beer in the alleyway and talking about lawn care, like that, those were my neighbors.
Right. And Nick, you liked it because you had come from somewhere else, and like you were obviously with this different lens looking at the show and being like, well, they're capturing it. Whereas I grew up in this, very similar town, also in North Texas, Grapevine. I'm in Tarrant County. I'm on the other side of the airport. So I'm growing up with this very, very similar lifestyle, but for some reason, I saw the show and was like, why would I want to watch a show that's just my life every single day? Like, it was so realistic that I was like, this is not exciting to me.
I think there's a difference here, and it's that, like I said, I related to Connie.
Sure,
and so,
absolutely.
I related to Connie, and I saw it as Luann was the kind of girl that I wished I was. I mean, hopefully less dumb, but I could, you'd want to like grow up to be like Nancy Gribble, but like, yeah, but it was like, so I was also always looking at it through this lens of like, a little bit reserved, like, this is not my culture, this is what I'm growing up in, and observing it through that. And so for me, it was kind of like, oh yeah, this show gets it. They're seeing it the same way I'm seeing this.
There's a bit of a sort of outsider perspective going on there, like not quite fitting in to something larger, even if you have just as much claim to it as the people that lived there. Whereas, me coming from like a Bobby Hill kind of place.
Were you a Bobby Hill? Something wasn't right with you?
My dad didn't ever say it quite out loud to me that way, but that I think there was an undercurrent of that there, and with both my brother and I think to an extent those boys weren't right, but luckily they were loving and supportive in a way that Hank Hill can be. Exactly.
What's beautiful, and I said this as a parent. I mean, one of the great dynamics of the show, and I think my older son was 3 years old or 4 years old when it came out, but like, each of the main kids, so it's, Bobby, Connie, and Joseph are all problem children somehow. They're atypical and they represent, conflicts to their parents in profound ways, but they're also totally identifiable because they all feel out of sorts. And I came to
say they're problem children because aren't all children kind of problem children?
Absolutely, absolutely. And Kat, I know you have a kid, so like, yeah, you know this, but that's what's so beautiful about it is, and ultimately they are loved by their parents. I choke up even thinking about when Dale, who obviously somewhere, in the insecticide-soaked brain of his, he knows that Joseph is not his child, but he loves him.
He said several times he thinks
he loves him. Yeah, that he's the child of Alien, right? And he loves him all the more. It's like, it's so beautiful. I came to King of the Hill as a huge Mike Judge fan from Beavis and Butthead, and my reading of Beavis and Butthead on MTV was, it was a show that was teaching us as cable and as the internet and as like the information age came upon us. And Beavis and Butthead ultimately was a show about how do you consume and critique slick images and slick information that, was coming in the form of music videos, but it was a tutorial on how to live in like the information age.
You and just that's made one of the reasons want to go watch Beavis and Butthead again.
Yeah, it's
I always
fantastic.
Hate it I don't like vulgarity, but
I
love Daria.
It really made it was didactic in the best ways that popular culture can be. It like teaches you a method of how to kind of understand things. So I kind of brought that to King of the Hill, and I think in a way that's what the show was doing. It was like scenario after scenario of like, if you are a kind person but you are beset with all of these contradictions of like bigness versus individualism, collective identity versus a marginal identity, when you don't feel comfortable in your own skin or, in your community, like, how do you deal with that? And, and that's one of the functions, I think, of King of the Hill, which was it gave us all ways of kind of just adjudicating these everyday kind of conflicts in a way that was ultimately kind of resolved to be nice to each other. That really is, ultimately the message of the show, which I think is actually deeply profound. Not that different than South Park, or even Family Guy in a lot of ways. These are all profoundly family-based shows, that take place ultimately, no matter how crass they may be, in a loving universe.
Well, and they're always coming back to these kind of moral lessons. Like it's not like a Bible show, right? Like they're not
Mhm.
trying to hit you over the head with the morality, but there is a clear morality and there's moral
Luann's Manger
struggle.
Babies. It's not
Yeah, the
Manger
Major
Baby,
Babies.
but
Yeah.
Right.
it's something better than that. Yeah.
Right, it's something that, like, Hank Hill is struggling with these moral questions throughout the whole show. We started off talking about how he would vote, and that's, like that seems that fits, like, it would be an episode because it's exactly the type of thing that Hank Hill struggles with throughout, even if it's, at the beginning struggling with the role of Luann in the family or all these other things. He's constantly being exposed to things that, he kind of in his head thinks are immoral or wrong, and then he's learning, like, well, I still want to be a loving, good human, and here's how I'm going to deal with it. And yeah, I think that's what makes the show good.
One of the episodes, if I can just throw this out there, which I've read is Mike Judge's favorite. It comes from the first or second season, and it's called Junkie Business. And this gets to a kind of libertarian flavor. I don't think Mike Judge may be a libertarian populist, but I don't even know that his politics go, that he's
That
interested in
deep.
politics at that
Mhm.
level. But it's when Hank hires a new guy, and he basically hires him not because of his resume, but because he knows a lot about the Dallas Cowboys. And the guy turns out to be named Leon Petard, and he turns out to be a junkie, and he gets protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which famously H.W. Bush signed into law. It was a big signature achievement in 1990. This came out in 1998, and then like everybody at Strickland Propane starts to say, "Well, I have a disability too," et cetera. And it's this great thing where Hank is a good guy and he wants to give people the benefit of the doubt, but he also doesn't want to put up with bullshit. But this is where a kind of edict from on far, on high comes down, and then it ends up protecting somebody who's acting in bad faith, and it creates a kind of viral phenomenon within the office where nothing gets done. And to me, that's one of the paradigmatic examples of what the show is about, because Hank again he's not mean, he's not nasty, but he just explodes because this is
And he's a
unworkable.
guy who cares about getting things done. I think one of my
Yeah.
favorite Hank Hill quotes is there's nothing sexier than a man with a 9 to 5 job. Like
Right.
that is Hank Hill. He believes like you have stuff, you get it done, you don't complain about it. And I think that's also like that's a type of old Texas attitude too that kind of carries
Yeah.
through.
Yeah, why would you smoke weed when you could just mow a lawn?
One of the other things that I really enjoyed about the show is that it was on from 1997 to 2009. And so it bridges this weird gap where after the Cold War, in the 90s, we had escaped history and all of that kind of stuff, which is kind of great. And then 9/11 happens, and, in the 21st century has just been a clusterfuck. But, the aughts were a roller coaster of a decade. And King of the Hill, kind of bridges all of that. And but it's also showing a culture in transition. So, like, I think Kat is right that Hank exemplifies a certain type of positive Texas manhood, but he's so different than his father. And his father,
Yeah.
Cotton Hill, who is, the World War II vet who, the Japs blew his shins off and he killed 50 men. And he's just a complete jackass. He has a couple of moments of tenderness and kindness, but generally he is something to be avoided. And everybody knows that. And Hank is so much of a better person and a better father and a better worker than his father. It's kind of great to see the historical continuity that the show does through all of its, references to stuff that is just wonderful, but is disappearing in real time, but also showing how things have changed and things can change for the better.
Well, I think his relationship with his father is one of the big moral struggles for Hank because Hank hates who Cotton Hill is as the person, not only because Cotton
Yeah.
Hill treats him really poorly, he's a terrible
Mhm.
father, but he also hates just the kind of like hateful, angry, aggressive, bigoted man he is. He mistreats Peggy, who's, Hank's big treasure. He
Yeah.
can't stand
Hank's
people
wife.
being, yeah, Hank's wife, right?
Yeah.
And,
And Dee
all
Dee.
of these things, he
Yeah.
hates everything about him, and yet Hank has this idea that he needs to respect him both because he's his father and because he is a military veteran. And then you kind of see like that's also a struggle with his mom's. His mom gets remarried a couple times, and Hank has that same struggle because these are men that he actually likes and finds to have that strong moral core, and yet they don't have those same outward stamps. They're not actually his father. They're not they're not veterans. They're the types of people that if he saw on paper he would think he wouldn't like. And it comes down to at the core they're just better people, and Hank is a much better person than Cotton ever will be.
Are there any other lessons that we can learn from Hank as the central character? Because he, while not a total stand-in for, who every person who watches the show is going to be like some protagonists are, he's certainly the one that we're supposed to be rooting for and the one who we experience the world through his eyes 90% of the time. And we talked about the theme of kindness and community and coming together at the end of the day, and his sort of at least attempt at a positive spin on masculinity in his community. Is there anything else that we could learn from him, whether it's from things that he exemplifies in a positive way, or maybe even mistakes that he's made? Whether it's the way that he handles his anger, or the way that he runs his business at Strickland Propane, etc. What else do you make of what we can take away from Hank Hill at the
Well,
end of the
so
day?
one thing that I think, so the show is actually most likely going to be making a comeback in the next year or two. They've announced that they're working on another rendition of King of the Hill. It's going to be an older version of it. And I think, at this point, our country is so terribly polarized that having a character like Hank Hill, who is a conservative, traditionalist kind of guy, he's very traditional masculinity, and he's just a good, kind person who's able to work with lots of different people, who's able to, you know, be a pillar of his community, no matter what that community is and the kinds of people that they are and all the different things that they represent. I think that hopefully will sort of influence the pop culture, the community that we see around us in America, which is really at a point where we're not like that. It's very polarized. People don't want to interact with anyone on either side of it. They're not open to that kind of person being a good person, and they're also the idea of conservatism as people see it now is certainly not Hank Hill's conservatism. And so I do think that art influences culture, and I hope that this show comes back, that it's just as good as it always has been, and I also hope that it gets just as popular and is able to kind of shift people back into a more harmonious, and hopefully more positive interactions than we've been seeing the last several years.
I do think that within Hank there is a serious critique of the type of person he is, though, too. And so, you mentioned like how does he deal with his anger, and he doesn't deal with it very well, and he has medical problems throughout because of that. But he grows a little bit. He's skeptical of yoga and of even stretching because somehow that seems a little bit Greenwich Villagey or something like that. But he ultimately
When he sees
embraces that.
Bobby working out with Luann and
Yeah.
Peggy.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a thing where, his X-rays where, because he's been eating meat his whole life, his colon is completely clogged. And, so there's a critique of who he is and how he, the limitations of him. I also think, and this will be interesting, I'm skeptical. This is not the first time that a new King of the Hill has been announced. There have been similar things like this for a while. So I hope it happens. I would love to see it, but I'm reserved. I have my doubts for a while. But also, there's an episode where Hank realizes that he has been getting screwed by his car dealer, who he thinks has always been on the square with him and has given him a really good price, just a little bit over the manufacturer's suggested retail price. And there's a series of moments like that where Hank begins to realize that the system that he has put his faith in is actually not a legitimate system, or it hides a lot of chicanery and fraud and deception, and it takes advantage of people. And in a way, I also think, if the show is updated from 2009 going forward, that is going to be a big theme because this is or rightly it could be, what has happened to not, everyone in America. I write a lot about this at Reason. If you go back 50 years, that the amount of trust and confidence in major institutions, whether it's the government, whether it's big business, whether it's, kind of third sector groups like the American Way or the Catholic Church, trust and confidence in these institutions has just, continued to go downwards because these institutions have been revealed as fake and fraudulent and self-interested, but kind of making all of us do sacrifice in the name of, their greater glory. And then you find out they're full of shit. I think that's a big part of, the journey that Hank will have been on since we last saw him. And, Judge, when you look at shows, like Office Space, again, I think Mike Judge is almost to TV and movies what Bob Dylan is to music. I mean, this guy has like a basically like a 4-decade legacy of, at least once a decade, just perfectly capturing and parodying and satirizing in a really deep knowing way what's wrong with America. And in shows like Beavis and Butthead, King of the Hill, Office Space captured, a late 90s, tech culture emptiness. Idiocracy, which is slowly being revealed as documentary realism. It's just that instead of it being 500 years in the future, it's like 15 years in the future. And Silicon Valley, just most recently captured this. So, what happens? Like, can you be Hank Hill in a world where all of your illusions of, that the world is a kind and just place, that's been the institutions are not there to support you. What happens next? That's really interesting territory, especially without it becoming very dark.
I look forward to, much like Bob Dylan, Mike Judge's evangelical Christian reinvention.
Oh God,
so
yeah,
that should be really, really
yeah,
fun.
yeah. He's only a second marriage away from that, I suspect.
Yeah, and then we'll get the Traveling Wilburys sort of rendition where he gets together with all the great comedy writers and they put out, like,
wouldn't that be
albums, and then one
great
of them
to
dies.
Matt Stone and Trey Parker and Seth MacFarlane, all in a Traveling Wilburys cartoon thing, even if they have a lot of beef amongst each other, and the Simpsons gang. Yeah. Can I ask you guys, like, how do you compare it? Because the one kind of pop cultural text that has been an absolute mainstay since before the collapse of the Soviet Union is The Simpsons, which is now in its like 800th year or something. And there's interplay between The Simpsons and King of the Hill. Each characters of each have shown up in the other. How do you, is it worth like thinking about King of the Hill in light of The Simpsons, which also made, kind of primetime animation possible again, which is just remarkable too.
I mean, they're both Americana. They're both slices of Americana. They're both
Yeah.
about the everyman, middle class American family, right? But I think that King of the Hill has, one, a lot more regional flavor, but two, in neither one do you know exactly where the town is. They're both made up towns, but Springfield is much more like somewhere in America. Arlen is
Or
somewhere in
everywhere in America.
Yeah, everywhere in
Yeah,
America.
yeah.
That's a
Right.
better one, right? I also just think that, like, King of the Hill is more realistic. These could almost not be animation. This could almost be, like, just real people, live acting this show, and it would work just as well. Versus, like, The Simpsons has that cartoon aspect to it, right? It's
Yep.
still a little bit over the top. It's still a little bit about, it's a little slapstick. It's a little fun in that way that I think King of the Hill isn't. And so I think that there are similar shows, but a little bit different. And one of the things that I think is actually worth noting here, when it comes to realism, is that King of the Hill is actually one of the very few animated shows, especially I think it might have been the only one at its time, that allows its characters to age a bit and allows them to grow and develop in a way that you don't really see in shows like The Simpsons. Simpsons was on like decades, right? Decades of Simpsons, and like, yeah, the animation style gets a little bit better, but they're the same family, and there's that internet meme that goes around that talks about how, like, maybe part of the reason that The Simpsons isn't as popular as it used to be is simply because it's not as depictive of what it's like to be an average American family anymore. And versus I think like King of the Hill, of course, it's not on the air anymore. It hasn't been for a while, but I think that it always kind of held on to what it was like to be a middle class family in Texas.
Right. And it's about observing that world moving forward and changing and evolving in a way, and what it means to look at it and sometimes feel left behind, but sometimes be mired in this, ever changing, uncertain future. Whereas The Simpsons is just kind of like, it's this weird, wibbly wobbly, timey wimey, locked in place sort of like snow globe of a show. And then you've got shows like you mentioned, Beavis and Butthead, which was all about a reaction to the slick, packaged like media consumption of the era. And then moving forward, even now, the big sort of animated series of, I think, that came on after King of the Hill, Family Guy,
Right.
obviously was a post Beavis and Butthead. It was not about what it means to digest all of that media. It's about where you go, and the sort of base of humor was what that did to people and how you can use jokes via this referential, like almost like the only reason I got half the jokes in Family Guy is because I love the 80s and I love the 70s was
Right.
on VH1 all the time, and I could sit
Yeah.
there for 6 hours on a Saturday and be like, I understand what life in the 1980s was like. And so it's interesting to see what King of the Hill might turn into if we jump forward in time, but if it will keep that element of trying to, understand the world moving forward, but being stuck in the past or something like that, or if it will take a new type of perspective and sort of way of examining the world.
I do, all of these, and I would throw South Park in, of course, as well. Like one thing that is great about the animated shows, and actually, as long as we're throwing everything in the hopper, Daria, which was kind of an outgrowth of Beavis and Butthead,
love
which
Daria.
I've also
So good.
heard is getting some kind of update or something potentially. Another very Texas show. I mean, it's really set in a suburb of McMansions and whatnot. But one thing that I love about the animated shows, probably more than live action shows, is that they really reward close watching and kind of, the second screen phenomenon. Like when you're watching it and you don't know who somebody is, that they build an episode around, and like you can Google it while you're watching it and you gain that enjoyment. Like, again, I hate pop culture that is didactic. I hate, like this is the old Frankfurt School model of cultural theory, which is, Donald Duck gets his punishment in the movies. So the assembly line worker takes his punishment at the workplace. Like that's not how pop culture works, but it enacts and embodies and it kind of conjures all this interesting information. And like what all of these shows did, and I thought this was really powerful in the 90s as our world was exploding with so much more information, so many more sources, just everywhere. You really benefit from knowing history and from knowing art, or even like earlier iterations of the show. I mean, The Simpsons is almost completely self-referential now. It's its own whole universe. And that can become annoying and frustrating after a while, but it's a good way of thinking about the world, like that, when you're walking down the street, that a lot of everything that's going on and the history of it, because if you know the history of it, and this is a very Marxist point on a libertarian podcast, but I think it's absolutely right, if you can historicize the current moment and you understand the ways in which we got to the moment we got, that it's not just nature, it's not just the way things happen, it's, happenstance. Things have happened for particular reasons. Once you know that and you understand it and you can reference it, you can maybe direct, things in a way that is hopefully, for all of us, I think, in the direction of kind of freedom and liberty and human flourishing. So that's a weird way to think about King of the Hill, but it's like it might be essential to a 21st century that's actually worth living in.
I mean, that's kind of the point of the show, right? Like, to some extent, we all kind of do believe that pop culture has the ability to change the way that people think about decisions, think about our government, think about, the way that we live. It's Pop and Locke with the E.
And that's exactly why I came up with that name. It was not just because of a pun. That's I totally had that line of thought when we brainstormed the name. It was
I
on
hope you
purpose.
weren't like Popper and Locke or something like that. Karl Popper.
No,
and,
no, no. We
the
never went
Open
that far.
Society
Never
and
that
John
far.
Locke. Okay.
Thanks for listening. As always, the best way to get more Pop and Lock content is to follow us on Twitter. You can find us at the handle @PopandLockPod. That's Pop, the letter N, Lock with an E like the philosopher, pod. Make sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and please rate and review us if you like the show. We look forward to unraveling your favorite show or movie next time. Pop and Lock is a project of libertarianism.org and is produced by me, Landry Ayres. To learn more, visit us on the web at libertarianism.org.